The Duke's sister accused the heir's mother of poisoning him. Then her return revealed the truth. There is a particular kind of cruelty that looks, from the outside, like concern. It wears the right clothes. It uses the right words. It shows up at exactly the right moment, not to help, but to take. And the tragedy is that most people around it never notice the difference, at least not at first. This is a story about that kind of cruelty. And it is also a story about what happens when one woman refuses to let it win. The Ashford estate sat on about 6,000 acres in the English countryside, the kind of old money property that had been in the same family for so long that the locals just called it the manor, without needing to say anything else. It had been built up over generations: land, title, influence, the whole picture. And when the 5th Duke of Ashford died suddenly from a riding accident in 1882, he left behind a young widow named Helena and a 9-year-old boy named Edmund, who was now, whether anyone liked it or not, the future of the entire estate. Helena was not from a titled family. Her father was a merchant from Bristol, successful, well-respected, but not nobility. She had met the Duke at an assembly some years before, and the two had married, despite the quiet disapproval of certain family members who felt she was not quite the right sort. She was warm, capable, practical, in the way that people who grow up around commerce tend to be. She loved her son. She ran the household well. She caused no trouble for anyone. But there was one person in that household who had never fully accepted her, and that was the Duke's older sister, a woman named Constance. Constance had grown up in that manner. She had watched her brother inherit everything their father had built, while she, as a daughter, received considerably less. That was simply how things worked in those days. She had never married. She lived in the west wing of the estate, comfortable enough, but always aware that the real authority in Ashford Manor was not hers. When the Duke was alive, she had managed this quietly. After his death, she had imagined things might change. And then she watched Helena step into the role of managing widow, and realized, with a cold fury she kept well hidden, that things had not changed at all. For nearly a decade, the two women existed in a state of frozen politeness. Helena raised Edmond, managed the estate accounts, and built a life around her son. Constance watched. She was patient in the way that people are patient when they are waiting for something specific. Not relaxed patience, but the kind that has a plan behind it. The winter of 1891 gave her what she had been waiting for. In January of that year, Edmund Ashford, 18 years old by then, on the edge of becoming a man and taking full control of his inheritance, collapsed during a morning ride. He was carried into the house pale and shaking. The family physician, a decent and experienced man named Dr. Whitby, who had served the estate for 20 years, was immediately concerned. Over the next 2 weeks, Edmund got worse. He could not keep food down. His skin had a yellowish look to it. There were spells when he could not think clearly, when he seemed confused about where he was, or what day it was. It was frightening to witness. The whole household was frightened. Nobody knew what was wrong with him. Dr. Whitby tried everything he could think of: rest, tonics, a plain diet, careful monitoring. But the boy did not improve, and while the household held its breath, and Helena sat at her son's bedside night after night, Constance was doing something else entirely. She was writing a letter, without telling Helena, without asking Dr. Whitby, without consulting anyone in the household. Constance wrote privately to a specialist in London, a physician who had done work in the area of poisoning cases. She paid for his travel from her own money, and when he arrived at the estate, she met with him alone for several hours before he had seen the patient even once. Think about that for a moment. A physician brought in specifically to assess a sick young man, and the first thing that happens is that the person who brought him sits him down privately and talks to him for hours before he has examined anyone. When the specialist finally saw Edmund, his report said the symptoms were consistent with arsenic exposure over several weeks. He named no source. Constance named one immediately. She gathered the estate's solicitors and senior staff and told them, in a voice that reportedly showed almost no emotion, that Helena had been poisoning her own son. The motive, she explained, was the inheritance. Edmund, dying before his 21st birthday, would create a legal situation that Constance, as the closest blood relative still standing, could use to take control of the estate. It was a clean story. It had a motive, a method, a victim, and a villain. The only problem was that it was not true. But truth, in a situation like that one, is not always the first thing that wins. Speed wins. Confidence wins. Social position wins. And Constance had all three. Within 48 hours, a local magistrate had been contacted. Helena was asked to leave the manor while an inquiry was conducted. She had no legal way to refuse. As a widow, with her son incapacitated, and the estate technically in trust, her standing was fragile, in a way she had not fully understood until that moment. She packed what she could, 2 trunks, a few personal items, her late husband's journal that she kept beside her bed, and she left the home she had lived in for over 20 years. She arrived at her father's house in Bristol in the middle of the night, in the rain, and said very little. In the days that followed, Constance moved quickly. She replaced Dr. Whitby, who had privately expressed doubts about the poison theory, with a physician more agreeable to her version of events. She had Helena's widow's allowance suspended. She had the household's post monitored. She dismissed the one maid who had chosen to accompany Helena, rather than stay at the manor. Everything was being locked down. The story was being fixed in place. But Constance made one mistake. She forgot about Helena's father. Thomas Beaumont was 71 years old that winter, and he had built a business from nothing by knowing how to look at a problem without flinching. When his daughter arrived at his door in the middle of the night and told him what had happened, he did not panic, and he did not advise her to stay quiet. He went to bed, slept 4 hours, got up at dawn, and started making arrangements. He hired a barrister. He started pulling records. And through a mutual acquaintance a few weeks later, Helena was introduced to a retired professor, a man who had spent most of his career in industrial chemistry and toxicology, now living quietly in Bristol. His name was Oakes, and he was exactly the kind of person Helena needed. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened at Ashford Manor. Edmund did not die. By spring he had stabilized. By summer, he was walking again. Thin, still recovering, but alive and getting clearer in his thinking every week. This was not the outcome Constance had been prepared for. She moved quickly to consolidate whatever she could, before Edmund recovered enough to start asking questions. But she could not stop him from writing letters. He had a loyal footman who carried them out without anyone knowing, and from June of 1891 onward, Edmund was writing to his mother. He was careful. He kept the letters simple in case they were intercepted, but across those months, he described his symptoms in detail. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had always preferred drinking from the old well near the kitchen gardens, a smaller, quieter source that a former housekeeper had always said tasted better than the main house supply. He asked his mother, without knowing why the question felt important, whether that well had ever been tested. Helena showed those letters to Professor Oakes. The two of them spent days at her father's dining table, with county maps, agricultural surveys, and every piece of Edmund's medical history they had managed to obtain through the barrister's requests, and slowly, a different picture came into view. The estate's north fields had a drainage problem that had never been properly fixed, standing water for years, soil that had never been properly assessed. Professor Oakes requested an independent geological survey, paid for by Thomas Beaumont, and what it found was extraordinary. The subsoil beneath that part of the estate was naturally rich in arsenic, not placed there by a person, not administered deliberately, but sitting in the ground as it had been for centuries, slowly leaching into the groundwater, concentrating, over time, in the small well near the kitchen gardens, the well that Edmund used every single day. And a kidney specialist named Dr. Aldridge, who Helena's barrister had located in London, reviewed all of Edmund's original medical notes, the ones Dr. Whitby had written before he was replaced, and confirmed that the symptom profile matched not deliberate poisoning, but chronic low-level exposure through contaminated water. There were specific markers in the original notes, recorded carefully by Dr. Whitby, and then simply overlooked when the more dramatic diagnosis came along. Helena had her answer. Now she had to deliver it. On the 3rd of October, 1892, 19 months after she had been forced out, Helena arrived back at Ashford Manor. She had written to her son, and Edmund had made sure the gates were open. She came with Professor Oakes, Dr. Aldridge, and the barrister. Constance was in the morning room when they arrived. By the accounts of those who were present, she appeared to believe, right up until the moment things began, that she was about to have Helena removed again. She was not. Professor Oakes presented the geological findings first. the survey results, the maps, the chemical analysis of the well water. Dr. Aldridge followed with a detailed medical comparison, what the original notes showed, what the contamination timeline looked like, how the symptoms aligned with long-term exposure to naturally occurring arsenic in a water source rather than with any kind of deliberate administration. Then the barrister produced the letters. Constance had written to a cousin during Edmund's illness. In those letters, she discussed the estate. She discussed what would happen if Edmund did not survive. She discussed Helena's vulnerability. She used language that made clear she had not been thinking like a grieving aunt. She had been thinking like someone managing an outcome. One line, read aloud in that room, said that she had prepared accordingly for the possibility that the boy would not last the season. Constance denied everything. She said the survey was fabricated. She questioned Oakes's credentials. She said the letters had been taken out of context. Edmund, who had sat quietly through all of it, asked her one question. He asked why she had met privately with the London specialist for 3 hours before he had examined anyone. She had no good answer. Within the week, Constance was removed from Ashford Manor. There was not enough evidence under the laws of the time to bring a criminal case against her. But the legal mechanisms for removing her from the estate were straightforward once Edmund made his wishes clear. She left England the following year and spent the rest of her life in Malta, where she died in 1904. Helena was formally reinstated as the managing duchess in November of 1892. The solicitors sent a letter acknowledging that the inquiry had been conducted on the basis of evidence that had since been thoroughly refuted. It was not an apology. Those were not the custom. But she kept it. The contaminated well was sealed. A new water supply was installed. The north fields were converted to woodland. Edmund Ashford grew into the kind of man who did not rush to conclusions. People who worked with him later in life said he had a habit, whenever a crisis arrived, of stopping and asking the same question before he did anything else. He would ask, what else could explain this? His mother had taught him that question, in the only way a lesson like that can really be taught, by living it herself, in the hardest possible circumstances, and by refusing to let the loudest story in the room be the last word. Helena died in 1921. Her portrait hung in the main hall of Ashford Manor until the estate was sold decades later, and the well, long sealed and forgotten, sat quiet in the corner of the kitchen garden, carrying its secret in the ground the way it always had. Not with malice, but with the indifferent patience of something that was there long before any of them, and would be there long after. The truth in this story did not arrive quickly. It did not arrive loudly. It arrived because one woman, with very little standing, and even less support, decided to ask better questions than the people who had accused her. That is sometimes all it takes. And sometimes, that is the hardest thing in the world.